Am I the host?
No, I'm making it right now. All right, you're a host now.
Okay.
And it's recording. So let me just welcome, whoever I didn't say. Natasha is here. Sergio, what's up? How are you, my friend? It seems like we see each other every day. And we're seeing each other tomorrow. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, early.
Early.
Okay, shall I share the screen?
Yes, go ahead. You can share the screen now.
We'll bring up the briefing. Everybody can see it?
No, not yet. You have to actually select it, John.
Oh, okay. I keep missing that second step.
Yeah.
You were right. So I select this. Share. Okay. People can see it?
Yes.
Yep, can see it.
Okay, the title screen. Shall I get going?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, this presentation will be on the Epic of Gilgamesh. I actually took a graduate seminar in it many years ago. First of all, the title is modern. The ancients, the Babylonians had no concept of epic. They did have a word for literary work, where they Ishkaru, where Gilgamesh was what we call the Epic of Gilgamesh was classified, but that's really anachronistic. But all the modern translations call it an epic. And an epic is usually, we'll go into this in some depth, an epic myth is concerned with gods. Epics are concerned usually with a mixture of gods and humans. So, that fits the Iliad and the Odyssey. Epic fits Gilgamesh as well, because the gods of Mesopotamia play a starring role in it. These are the principal sources I used. The one on the left, the Babylonian Gilgamesh epic, edited by Andrew George, was a revolution in Gilgamesh studies when it came out in 2003. Nobody had done this before. Gilgamesh comes to us in many fragments, and nobody had ever put all the fragments together into one book. And it's amazing how that sort of compilation can help a field. Before that, pretty much, 50% of the epic was scattered in obscure academic journals, and at least this was a major publication for that. I asked you to read, he did a popular presentation as well, translation called The Epic of Gilgamesh, and I asked you to read that. If you didn't, don't worry, I'm going to give you a plot summary anyway. A third book is a really charming book, The Buried Book. It was by a Columbia professor. It's about the discovery of Gilgamesh, which is a fascinating story in itself. As far as this is a list of the major Dramatis Personae in Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is king of the city-state of Uruk, the oldest, traditionally considered the oldest city in Sumer. He was 1/3 human, he was 2/3 divine. His father was Lugal-Banda, a human king. His mother was a goddess, Lady Ninsun, and how they, we would think of it in modern genetics, she should be 50-50 human and divine, but somehow they came up with 1/3 human, 2/3 divine, just sort of to increase his stature, I suppose. But Ninsun is his mother. Enkidu is his famous friend and companion. Shamkhad is a prostitute of Uruk who plays a charimtu, is the word for prostitute. That's what it means, and she plays a major role. Shamash is the sun god. That's the word for sun in Semitic languages. Humbaba, it's unclear exactly what he was. Was he human? Was he some kind of monster? He's always portrayed as being really ugly in Mesopotamian art, but he was the guardian of the cedar forest. And if you don't know what these are, it'll become clear as we go along. He was the guardian of the cedar forest in Lebanon. And Lebanon is actually mentioned in the epic. It's maybe the first occurrence of the name in history. Ishtar was the principal goddess of Uruk. Shadori was a minor goddess of wisdom, and she was a tavern keeper. It was something very odd about Babylonian society, as women were associated with bars and alcohol. I mean, in terms of being the owner, it's very odd. It's not just Shadori, but Ur-Shanabi was a ferryman of Utanapishti, and I'll explain who these people are. But he's the equivalent of the Charon, from classical myth, the guy who gets you across to the land of the dead. And Utanapishti is the survivor of the flood. He's the Noah equivalent. He's also known as Atrahasis, but he's mostly known as Utanapishti. Characters. As I said, Gilgamesh was king of Uruk. As you probably know, this audience, southern Mesopotamia is where civilization began. Let me get my pointer out. Right around here, down in the lower Tigris-Euphrates Valley, just on top of the Persian Gulf. I'm bouncing around here. But he was king of Uruk right there, and these were all small city-states very close to each other at the time. Uruk is probably where writing was invented. It was the major, I saw an estimate at 3000 BC, it may have had 40,000 inhabitants, which I don't know exactly how the archaeologists know that, but it certainly was substantial because all throughout Mesopotamian history, it gets pride of place as being the lead city. Here's a quick plot summary. The epic is divided into 12 tablets. I'll show you an example of that. I don't think it has, the Aeneid is in 12 books. That became standard, but I don't think there's any connection between them, but it's 12 tablets. The funny thing about Gilgamesh is that the tablets 1 through 11 form a united story. Tablet 12 appears to be a later add-on, and we can talk about that, why that happened, but they ended up with the prime number as the number of tablets for the whole story, and this may be only through, we think of the 12th tablet as being an add-on, but it just may be only our modern, the way we see it with our modern eyes. But anyway, tablets 1 and 2 are devoted to the arrival of Enkidu. Now Gilgamesh, this is where I need my script. Gilgamesh, as I said, was king, but he was tyrannizing the people of Uruk. The nature of how he was tyrannizing them is very controversial in the field. It may have been sexual in that he, insisted on the jus primae noctis with all the young women before they got married. The king would have his rights of access on the first night. And the young men of Uruk were subject either to corvée labor to intensive athletic contests. That sounds ridiculous, but there's one fragment of Gilgamesh where Gilgamesh is riding the young men around a field, and they appear to be playing polo, albeit without horses. I mean, it would have been on foot. But it's very elliptical what's in tablet 1 as to how Gilgamesh is tyrannizing. So that has opened a wide arena for disagreement as to what it was, but it's critical to the epic. So what happens is Gilgamesh is tyrannizing. The gods hear about this, so they aren't going to put up with it. So they decide to create a counterpart. And gods can create humans. They create a counterpart to Gilgamesh, and they do so. They create him from clay, from the earth. They call him Enkidu, which in Sumerian means Lord of the sweet earth, and he lives like an animal. He's naked. He eats. It's unclear whether he has any language. By the time he does get to human society, he's speaking very good Sumerian and Akkadian. How he learned that is unknown, but he just hangs out with the animals. And then, as a result, the gods further arrange for Enkidu to come to Uruk. The way they do this is to entice him. They send a prostitute named Shamkhat to go meet him, seduce him, and then persuade him to come back. Because presumably Enkidu was a virgin until he met Shamkhat. There were no human women in his condition of savage. I won't say it's savagery, but primeval humanity. You can see parallels with the Garden of Eden here. So he comes back to Uruk. He hears about Gilgamesh, and one argument is, this is actually mentioned in one of the fragments, is that Enkidu was so outraged that Gilgamesh is oppressing the young women of Uruk sexually that he challenges him to a fight. And they fight. Gilgamesh, it's a tough fight, but Gilgamesh eventually wins. And it being a bromance of sorts, they immediately become best friends. And so there's a pause in the epic at this point. And a little bit later, maybe a lot later, it's unclear. This is tablets 3 and 4. Gilgamesh proposes the idea of an expedition to the cedar forest of Lebanon to confront the bad guy, whether human or monster is unclear. There's a portrayal of him right there. That's more or less contemporary, maybe Old Babylonian, and there's the cedar forest. And basically they go there and they attack him. There's an immense, you see it says tablets 3 to 5, so it covers a lot of territory, but there's an immense amount of repetition in the epic. In the style of the epic, if somebody says something in conversation to someone else, the person who hears it, before they respond, they repeat back the same conversation word for word. So it's not to our literary tastes, but that's the way they did it back then. But anyway, eventually Gilgamesh and Enkidu, they're victorious in destroying Humbaba. And they go back to Uruk. Oh, they collect all the cedars. They cut down a bunch of cedars and they construct a raft and they float them down the Tigris all the way to Uruk. Now Ishtar has a special feeling for the bull, for Humbaba, because he was under the protection of the gods. Ishtar is the Venus equivalent in Mesopotamian mythology. She runs to heaven and asks her father Anu, the sky god. Anu is just Sumerian for sky. She asks Anu to provide her the services of the bull of heaven. This is a creature is identical with the constellation Taurus. Taurus, that's Latin for bull. So she wants the bull of heaven to go down and pay back Gilgamesh and Enkidu. So the bull of heaven, somehow he gets to Earth. That's not specified in the epic. And he's doing great damage to Uruk, destroying the harvest and flooding the fields and all that sort of thing. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu are again able to kill him, defeat him. Now, at this point, Ishtar proposes to this is the way the epic is always turning around people's attitudes. First, Gilgamesh and Enkidu become best friends, and then Ishtar is angry with Gilgamesh, but she's quite struck by his physical beauty. She proposes to him and he turns her down because she has a history of treating her lovers very badly, according to the epic. I think Dumazi, the Sumerian god, was one example who she didn't do too well by. So as a result, what happens is the gods, Ishtar is able to persuade the gods and council. There's in their mythology, the gods have a great council chamber where they take great decisions. But she persuades the gods in council that Enkidu must die as punishment, not Gilgamesh. No reason is given why Enkidu and not Gilgamesh. But basically Enkidu, and by the way, the image I have here, I chose for this, probably has nothing to do with the Gilgamesh epic, but it looks really good. It's from the Standard of Ore. It's one of the more beautiful pieces of Sumerian art. It was found in a massive burial chamber by Leonard Woolley. It does present a ceremony of some kind, so I'm pretending it could be the funeral ceremony of Enkidu, because elite Mesopotamians were buried with all sorts of rare grave goods to take to the netherworld. But again, nobody really knows. This is a ceremony, but nobody really knows what it's of. And so Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh is really broken up about that. There's a famous line I had in the script. I will paraphrase it for you. I grieved over Enkidu until a worm fell from his nose, Tultu in Akkadian. So Gilgamesh recognizes that Enkidu is decomposing, so he has to do something about that. So Enkidu is buried. Gilgamesh's heart is broken. This is the first time in his life he suffered loss, apparently. Before, he was an arrogant king, a great king, behaving in very adolescent ways, if the stories about, forced athletics is true. But he's really quite upset and depressed. So at that point, he starts thinking about death. He becomes really obsessed with it because his best friend died, or maybe lover died. We'll get back to that in a bit. But he decides to go on a quest for immortality. And the way he does this, he has an ancestor called Utanapishti, which translates as "I found life." Now, Utanapishti is someone in the distant past. Humanity had offended the gods. In one version of the story, in the Atrahasis epic, the offense consisted of mankind being too noisy and keeping him from sleeping. The gods are very human-like, as they are in Roman and Greek mythology. They sleep, they eat, they do all that stuff. But they get very upset at humanity's noise, and they decide to bring a great flood. Now, the first time I read Gilgamesh in school, I had a noisy neighbor, so I was very strongly on the god's side at this point. But anyway, Ea, who's the sly god, Enki is another name of him, he's friends with Utanapishtim, and he decides to save him. So he gets a message to Utanapishtim that he should construct an ark and be prepared for the flood. And the flood happens, and humanity is destroyed. Only Utanapishtim and his family survive. There's no account of, I forget if Utanapishtim brings animals on board with him into the ark, but I'm sure he did. But when the flood subsides, he gets stuck on a mountain, not apparently Ararat. And he sends out, when the flood subsides, he sends out birds, a succession of birds to find dry land. And I think he sends 3, which should sound familiar to readers of the Bible. And the third one does not come back. So he knows that there's dry land somewhere. So he eventually, escapes from that. And the message for Gilgamesh wants to know, in hearing the story from Utanapishtim tells him the story of the flood when he meets him. Utanapishtim tells him that after the flood, the gods didn't really quite know what to do with Utanapishtim, but they decided, again, the reason is not entirely clear, to make him immortal. But then they took a decision again in the Grand Council that except for Utanapishtim, immortality would be reserved for the gods. No human would ever survive. And Utanapishtim delivers this grand, very negative report, and Gilgamesh is crushed. Oh, I skipped over the whole part about, to get to Utanapishtim, Gilgamesh had to cross the circular oceans surrounding dry land and cross the waters of death. And he did it with very much, it sounds very familiar to those who know Roman mythology, people who have to cross the river Styx to get to the land to where Utanapishtim is, I should say, which is close by the land of death, but it's not, it's all, the cosmography is very vague in the epic, but anyway, he finds Utanapishtim, they have this conversation, and Gilgamesh gets the bad news that he ain't gonna live forever no matter what. So he's crushed. Utanapishtim delivers a message and again, I think I have it on a slide down the road, so I'll pass over now, but he basically tells Gilgamesh that he should be happy with the life he has, enjoy the wife he has, enjoy your children, etc., etc. So Gilgamesh matures from being an arrogant oaf, king of Uruk. He sort of slinks back to Uruk, a wiser and a hopefully a better man. So that's the plot summary. I hope I didn't hash it up too much for you, but that's basically the story. It's about almost an adolescent personality who, through the course of events, acquires some wisdom. There's a category of literature in the ancient Near East called wisdom literature, which basically tells you how to live better. Ecclesiastes is probably the most famous one in the Bible, but Gilgamesh is the first one that we know of. Anyway, Nineveh, I'm going to talk a little bit about, any questions, by the way?
Anybody has any questions on any slides or the plot itself, or more to add anything?
Just one comment. While you were talking, John, I about Humbaba, I did a quick look in Wikipedia. So Humbaba is a direct ancestor of Medusa.
Really? I did not know that.
Yeah, it was, yeah. I mean, you can see it in the picture, and some of the early archaic.
Yeah, they had the very ugly.
Right, and some of the that straight-on face is the Medusa, the Gorgonion, and some of the early archaic views of Medusa's face, she has a beard.
Interesting.
Yeah, I have a question. I get the gods, the Uruk or Sumerian pantheon. I guess this is presumably a Sumerian pantheon, not specifically of Uruk.
They're very similar. The gods tend to have both Sumerian and Akkadian names.
Yeah, and it sounds, as you mentioned, kind of like the Greek gods. They're not nature spirits, but they do tend to be sky gods or gods of nature features of life, but not local nature spirits as you find in Japan, for example.
Completely. Lady Ninsun, Gilgamesh's mother, they don't know for sure, but her name means wild cow. So they think she may have been associated with a cult of cattle. It may have been very local. So.
What about Hera?
What about Hera?
Was that Hera that you were talking about?
No, Ninsun.
Because isn't Hera called the wide-eyed cow?
Oh, she is?
That's what I remember.
She is. She's always sometimes called cow-eyed Hera.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Interesting.
Expression of beauty.
I guess one other comment
But the ancients were different.
On the flood. As I recall from the text, in fact, he does take animals on the ark.
He does, yes.
And in fact, I mean, to me, as I read it, there's no question, but this is the same story as Noah's flood.
I'm going to go into this in some detail, but all the similarities between Gilgamesh and non-Mesopotamian sources are maybe, possibly, but the flood story is undeniable, in my opinion, because it's specific, especially the birds being sent out to find dry land.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't resolve the question. Did the authors of Genesis have a copy of a Gilgamesh tablet in front of them?
Well,
I doubt it, but it probably can't. Gilgamesh was so popular that it was even translated into Hittite and Hurrian. The tablets, fragments of tablets found in Israel, also Palestine, so it could well have been part of Western Levantine literary culture.
Well, also a lot of the Hebrew Bible was written around the time of the Babylonian captivity, so it doesn't even have to come to Israel. The Israelites went to Babylon, and since this was, I guess this was a very prominent story around this time, around 500-600 BC, the Israelites almost probably would have encountered it.
Yeah, there's a good book that came out by Irving Finkel. He's an Assyriologist at the British Museum. That's his claim exactly, is that it was Jewish elites who were taken into captivity. Some of them were undoubtedly, they learned some Akkadian and cuneiform, And so that's how they got access to the Gilgamesh story, because Gilgamesh was a proud possession of Ashurbanipal in his library. There were 3 copies of it, and it had I don't want to say the script, but the quality of the cuneiform is about the highest you see in all of Mesopotamia. So it clearly was prized. So anybody who had a claim to literacy, who had a claim to knowledge of literature in Mesopotamia would have read it. So, and the Jews probably brought it back with them. That's quite possible.
I think it's quite possible that they got it before then. I mean, I think one of the places where they found copies of the Gilgamesh stories in Ugarit.
Yeah, and also
so
Ima
so that shows that the story had already reached the shores of the Mediterranean.
No, this was the first
Bronze Age.
This was the first bestseller in history, and even
So
when you consider how difficult.
So what I'm saying is that the story was definitely accessible to people in that part of the world for 1,000 years before the Babylonian exile.
Well, even longer. There was an oral.
Yeah, at least.
Opinion now is that I can get it. Let me put that off the literary history, how the Gilgamesh tale came into existence, because it's complicated. But that's true. Gilgamesh was floating around in oral or written form from 2000 BC onwards.
One other comment about the goddess Ishtar. It's kind of it's misleading just to kind of say that she was like Venus or Aphrodite, because she was much more powerful. I mean, Aphrodite is shown as being very weak and getting wounded on the battlefield and so forth, but Ishtar was a goddess of death and a goddess of war, as well as being a goddess of love. You did not mess around with Ishtar.
Well, Gilgamesh sort of got away with it. He only lost Enkidu.
Yes, and he got away with a lot, and he was kind of, the exception that proves the rule.
Yes.
I actually heard that it was more compared to Isis in Egyptian pantheon. And of course, the other name for it is Astarte.
Yes, and Inanna in Sumerian.
Yeah, the difference, by the way, in the flood myth, that in Bible, it's the God tells Noah to build.
Greg, can you come closer
to
the microphone? It's hard to hear. Sorry.
The God said, the God kind of told Noah to build an ark, and here Utnapishtim took initiative by himself and actually angered the god Elil, I believe, in the beginning. But then the god, after a while, reconsidered and thought that he did the right thing and made him immortal. But I recall reading that the god Elil was very angry at this initiative that Utnapishtim took.
Do you notice in this picture of Ishtar the owls?
Yeah, I was.
Don't they look so much like the Athenian owl?
Yes. I wondered about her feet too. Do you know what those are?
They're definitely birds' claws.
Yeah, birds.
And she has wings.
And she's got wings too. So she's like one of those. I don't know. Is the chimera? One of those part human, part animal monsters. And the thing that she's holding in her left hand looks a lot like the Egyptian Ankh.
Yeah, it does look like an Ankh sign without the tail.
The other thing is interesting is that they are like Greek gods, because not only that they behave in a human way, the gods, but they also obviously have an intercourse with humans and children. And I recall that one of the things that why Gilgamesh rejected Ishtar is because he thought of her very like a immoral and you know, the, like very low standards, you know, almost like a slut.
That's the pot
and-
calling the kettle black.
I just read this part, just, you know, I was eating, so just in the hour before today, I just read it. So his real objection to Ishtar is that everybody that she has a relationship with ends
Right.
up, you know, dead
Yeah,
or turned into a bad creature, or, you know, I mean, it's you don't have a good outcome if you have a dalliance with her. And Dumuzi, his name translates as the scapegoat. And it's, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Robert Graves.
Oh,
Of
yes.
course.
And his
How could we
theory
not? With I Claudius.
his theory of the triple goddess.
No, I was
Right.
the white goddess.
The white goddess, that's right, the
Yes.
triple goddess of birth, maturity, and death. So Ishtar really kind of resembles her, and one of Graves' points is that the part of this myth of the white goddess is that there's a new king every year, and the king has a great year, and then the end of the year they kill him, and he's the scapegoat when they kill him, and then you get a new king the next year, and he gets to be the king and enjoy all that stuff, and then in December, bye-bye.
Yeah. Another thing that I recall about this, that number 7 is a sacred number. And at some point, Gilgamesh slept through 7 breads, which probably meant
He what
years.
through 7?
Breads.
He slept, and they gave him a loaf of bread for each night.
Oh, yes, he was challenged to
for
stay
7 breads.
awake.
No, but I think that it could also mean that 7 years.
Well,
Because,
Greg,
the harvest.
I think you're onto something there, because I noticed also that when the flood comes, the deluge, the flood lasts for 6 days, and on the 7th day it stops. Right?
Well, everything, that's a common cliche. Anything important seems to last for 6 days and 7 nights. I think Gilgamesh grieves over Enkidu for 6 days and 7 nights.
And so that's another
And
parallelism with the Hebrew Bible.
And yes, and Shamkat and Enkidu have sex for 6 days and 7 nights.
Well, I wanted to ask a question, maybe that's throughout the presentation. Why was he so enamored with mortality and being an immortal? And he was so pissed about it. Like, would this be, and maybe this is just an ongoing question, kind of theme of this whole thing, John, mostly, and then whoever wants to answer as well.
Well, ancient personalities are hard to figure. We're looking at them from the outside. We moderns would say he had fallen into a depressive episode after the death of Enkidu, and he developed this obsession with his own mortality. But it's not expressed that way. It's just he becomes very, before Enkidu's death, he never thought twice about death. Afterwards, he becomes obsessed enough to leave his kingship. I didn't go into the details, but he starts dressing like the savage Enkidu, the wild Enkidu, in animal skins, and he wanders the world looking for Utanapishti. And why? I think it sounds like the scribe, and it does seem to be an individual behind it who created that melancholy tone of the epic. And I'll get to that because you can see it in the text. It sounds like a middle-aged person thinking thinking dark thoughts, youth having passed.
I think it's his development, and I mean, he's very selfish at the beginning, and then he winds up, and it's like he's growing up. He's really, and that's
yeah. Some people say he has a very. One critic said he had a very adolescent personality. The relationship between him and Enkidu did resemble 2 guys out on the town, having fun, but a lot is left out though. So let me.
I have one last question from Mark. 1 second, Marika, and then he'll ask a question. Mark, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So I just wanted to go over something that I've heard before. I just want to get the chronology correct. Someone had mentioned that the Jews in Babylon in 500 BC would have heard this story and then incorporated it into the Torah / Old Testament. Is that correct?
Yeah, let me get it straight. Ashurbanipal was late 7th century, I believe, say 625 BC. The Jews were carried into captivity in 586 BC.
Yes.
Correct. And then
They
the
stayed there
Babylonians
until 538.
Excuse me?
And they stayed. The migration back happened at 538, 535.
So Ashurbanipal's library had not been destroyed during the time they were there. I believe the Babylonians conquered Nineveh in 602.
That's 612.
612. So,
but I think it was Medians who burned Nineveh.
So it was. Okay, so I thought the Old Testament / Torah was thousands of years old.
Well, you know, it's very controversial, and the point about I think that the consensus of scholars is that there are multiple sources for the Old Testament, and this was begun, by the Germans in the early 19th century, who developed what's called the documentary hypothesis. And I believe that these stories are from what's usually called the J source, and I think the J source is older than the Babylonian exile myself. I think these stories were available. For
the patriarchal stories are J, I believe.
What's that?
J and E. I think that the late source in Genesis is the priestly, and
yes.
These are just scholars.
Well, right. The priestly source is very possibly that's what happened in Babylon. But I think that the J source in particular is the oldest of the sources. The E source after that. Yeah.
It's important to remember in the Bible is that it got edited and re-edited over generations, and they merged texts and added material and probably subtracted material. So you really end up with a palimpsest,
which
is a bunch of things put together, which is why we see two stories concerning the creation of man in chapters 1 and 2, which differ in detail.
There's two stories on many incidents. And there's a version of the Bible that's published called the Bible with Sources Revealed, or the Torah with Sources Revealed, which is really great. And what it does is it prints out, it's a translation of the first 5 books, the books of Moses, in which all of the different sources are shown in a different typeface and a different color. And you can see that if you read, if you just read the J source and skip the others, you get a coherent narrative. If you read the E source and skip the others, you get a coherent narrative. When you put them all together, you have contradictions and unexplained things that don't make sense at all.
Yeah, and the other thing too, Paul, is you have duplications. For example, Noah's story, I think, is actually told twice. It's like Groundhog's Day. They tell one version of the narrative, and then they repeat it slightly differently. For example, I don't think the birds come in till the second version of it. The Garden of Eden is like that too. Creation. They tell the story, and then the story is told again. Slightly different.
Very much so.
There clearly were threads that were
the detail about Eve being created from a rib taken from Adam is not in the first version. Right. It's only in the second.
The story of the captivity of Joseph being sold into captivity. In one version, he's sold to the Midianites, and in another version, he's sold to the Moabites. And they're just right next to each other.
Yeah, they had.
And it's, and we probably should let you get on with it, John, because you're probably going to address some of this. Stuff about
interesting thing about the Gilgamesh epic is that you can see the seams in the text where it's a very interesting case, and I think a very convincing one, is that, let me get back to it, it's interesting, but I have a slide on it.
One more observation. Gilgamesh is reminding me a lot of Hercules.
Yeah.
You know, he's first of all, he's a bull in the china shop. You know, he doesn't know his own strength, and he's got all these missions to go on, all these quests he has to go on. If you look at the picture over here with him, with his foot on, that's the bull of heaven. When I did my art presentation, I showed that the Greek showed Hercules with his foot in the back of the central
that is true.
in the exact same pose, So you know, I'm saying that these stories from from Sumeria and Mesopotamia spread throughout the world.
And, may
Oh, very
I
much
also
so.
add one more thing about the Gilgamesh, because I remember at the very end, it was a very interesting thing that I wonder what that means, that he actually went to the bottom of the sea in search of the flower of youth.
Oh yes.
But the snake stole it, so he didn't get it. And also, like, the snake has some kind of connotation. I wonder what it was. I mean, like, some people think that it's mischievous and
Well,
very,
actually, that's a
Oh,
great.
some people think it's smart, it's wise. I don't know what the connotation in Mesopotamia was at the time, but it's very interesting that the snake stole this from him. And interesting. There are other stories later on.
Well, it is a folklore motif.
Yeah.
It's seen in other cultures.
Very much. Yeah.
The skin shedding is associated with immortality, the renewal of the snake.
Right.
And compare the net effect of the snake in the Bible story versus here. In both cases, it led to man having to embrace his mortality and his death, right? The fall of man is the direct result of the activity of the snake, just like the snake essentially stole the Garden of Eden by getting them thrown out. Here, the snake steals the plant of eternal youth.
Thank you, guys. I think, John, you should continue,
Yeah,
and we will.
I will.
We will do more of this. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay, I'll talk about the discovery of Gilgamesh, because it disappeared for 2,000 years. It was buried in the earth. It was found at Nineveh, which at the time, this would have been the 7th century, as I said, 8th and 7th century. But this was the capital of Assyria. If you recall, Uruk is in the south. This is where the Sumerians were concentrated. And Gilgamesh is very much a Sumerian product. I mean, the Semitic-speaking Akkadians had come in and intermingled with the Sumerian in ways we don't fully understand. But the high culture was very Sumerian all the way through. The Assyrians were less cultured, if I can put it that way. They looked up to the Babylonians as the sort of like the Romans and the Greeks. But at the time, the political power was in Nineveh. And Ashurbanipal had founded his great library there. And I'll talk about its excavation next. These are the two figures who did the original work on excavation. On the left, you have Austin Henry Layard, who seems to have been a British ne'er-do-well, but independently wealthy. And he sort of bumped around the Middle East in the 1840s. And he heard that there were some ancient ruins close to Mosul. It turns out Mosul, which became famous in our country when ISIS, the terrorist group, became such a big deal, Mosul is directly across the Tigris from the site of Nineveh. The person on the right is Hormuzd Rassam. He's a Syrian Christian who evidently was from a wealthy merchant family. He converted to Anglicanism under the influence. There were English missionaries active in Iraq. It wasn't called Iraq. It wasn't called Iraq at the time. It was an Ottoman province. but he converted to Anglicanism, and somehow he made a connection when Layard came, interested in excavating. Rassam became his deputy. Let's see, and so where they focused was on this mound on the left here. This is the remains of Nineveh. What it is really is just a mound of earth under which lies the ruins of Nineveh, but over time, people throwing things out, things accumulated. This mound here, it's called Kuyunjik, by the way, the mound. The ruin underneath it is called Nineveh. But Kuyunjik is just a mound that there were, the locals always said that there were ruins of ancient cities around here. It was about a mile long, about 25 or 40 feet off the floor. And on the right, you see a different angle of the same shot. This was something taken in the 30s. Right now, it's actually, this mound here is sort of surrounded by urban Mosul. But in the 30s, it was still out there by itself. And there you see the trenches that Layard and Rassam actually dug. Oops, I'm going to have to do this from memory again. What they found in the first expedition was the Palace of Sennacherib. The Palace Without Rival was the name of it, sort of like Nonsuch. Henry VIII had a palace called Nonsuch, meaning nothing else like it. And Sennacherib, the great Assyrian king, had a palace called Palace Without Rival. So the name sort of, same idea occurs to different people at different times. But there they found the Palace of Sennacherib, and basically, it being the 19th century and imperialism was morally okay, they shipped a whole bunch of stuff back to the British Museum, who was sponsoring them. And that included a lot of the familiar types of things you associate with winged bulls, a fair number of clay tablets with cuneiform written on them. Of course, Layard and Rassam could not read the cuneiform at the time. Only a very few people could make any inroads into those tablets, and they weren't capable of it. They were archaeologists. They weren't people who knew the language. There's a real professional split between the two groups in the field. You either go digging in the dirt or you read tablets in the tent and never go near the excavation. But this is what it looked like. And the first thing they found was Sennacherib's palace. At that point, Layard, who was well connected, decided to go into politics. So he returned to England, and he eventually ended up in the diplomatic service, but he was out of archaeology. So in a rather impressive deed for mid-19th century Englishmen, he recommended Rassam to the British Museum to take his place. And the British Museum acceded to that. So Rassam was the first archaeologist of Middle Eastern descent, because, you know, the ruling government, the Ottomans, they really didn't care about any of this stuff. You know, anything you found would be graven images, and you know, they needed to be destroyed anyway. But Rassam was the first archaeologist, and he went on to even greater heights, because he dug another trench, and he went to the other side of the mound, the northern side, I believe, and he dug down, and he found Ashurbanipal's palace, who was Sennacherib's grandson. And he dug through, and these palaces were huge, even by modern standards. Sennacherib's had 70 large rooms. And Rassam dug through room after room, and eventually he came to one that was just filled with broken tablets, and that was Ashurbanipal's library. So it being the 19th century again, they just scooped up 100,000 tablets, and archaeology was not too scientific at the time, so they paid no attention to context. You know, two pieces lying next to each other you might want to record that fact. They might be connected. They didn't bother with that. But they shipped all those tablets back to the British Museum, and that's where Assyriology was founded. That's where it began. And it's sort of funny to say, but the prime area of research turned out to be the basements of the British Museum, because they had by far the largest collection of accessible tablets. So you can think of it as the biggest jigsaw puzzle ever accomplished, is that a large part of the work for the last 170 years has been very strange people going through and trying to match up tablet fragments. And I should say, Nineveh was destroyed, and by fire, presumably. We know tablets were stored on wooden shelves. The wooden shelves were destroyed. The clay out of the tablets hardened, but it didn't prevent them from breaking when they hit the ground. So the great majority were in fragments. We were lucky with the Epic of Gilgamesh. We got about 2/3 of it as a whole. But by and large, the tablets, the first step is to put them together. And to have them all in the same place at the British Museum was very conducive to that. Well, there it was for 20 years.
John.
Yes.
John?
Yes.
One story about the tablets is that they were originally unbaked. They were just sun-dried tablets, which would have disintegrated over the years, and they only survived because the palace burned down.
Because they were fired. That's the story I've heard. I haven't looked into it in any detail. Yeah, they become rock hard when you fire them, but typically they're only sun-baked. It being a very hot environment, that makes sense.
So also that they have very little wood there.
Yeah,
wood is
correct.
a very precious commodity. And Gilgamesh himself, on a few different occasions, brags about how the walls of Uruk are fired brick.
Yeah.
And that's really unusual. One reason you see these mounds is because all the cities are built of mud brick. And, before too long, they turn back to mud.
Yeah, correct. Well, that's what Mesopotamia has a lot of. So anyway, about 20 years passed, and there was greater knowledge of the Assyrian language. That's what it was called. It was patient work. We've discussed it before, I think, in another group, but basically the basis for the decipherment of Assyrian was the existence of that trilingual inscription by Darius I on one of the languages was Akkadian. It was easier to decipher Old Persian because they had fewer signs and there were proper names in there, and they could guess the deciphers, the original decipher that it was. So that was his name occurred. That was the starting point for the entire decipherment. At that point, they were able to extend what they had gained Old Persian. They could extend it to the Assyrian. It was actually a Middle Babylonian dialect. But that was the beginning of the decipherment of Assyrian. And by the 1870s, you could read it fairly well, maybe 50%. I haven't looked carefully at what they could read. You can see that the first effort, I should say George Smith, let me tell his story. He was a very interesting person. He was a engraver with sharp eyes and really fine handwriting, as an engraver would have. He never attended college. In fact, he had a job about a mile from the British Museum in London. And on his lunch hours, which must have been lengthy, the Victorians were funny that way, he would spend time at the British Museum on his lunch hour, just and eventually he got so obsessed and they liked him so much, they offered him a job. He was the first Assyriologist to ever get a paycheck. Now, one day he was joining tablets. He was looking at tablet fragments, putting them together, and he was sitting at a table in a room with other people, and he realized what he was looking at was a story that was very much like the flood story in the Bible. And this was 1872, and the story goes that he got so excited, and remember, this is a very religious age. Anything like this got a lot of attention. And the story goes that when he realized what this was, and it was part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which contains a flood story, if I haven't mentioned that, he jumped up, started to undress, and ran around the room. Now, what that detail about starting to undress means, I don't know, but it's not recorded how far he got. So, but that's a little story. But anyway, he, based on this find, he gave a talk. I forget, it's in my script, but it's some public institution for learning. He gave a talk on the flood story that he had found that so resembled the Noah story in the Bible. And William Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, was so interested, he actually showed up. You can't imagine a senior politician. Well, Boris Johnson does do classics, actually. But apart from Boris Johnson, you can't imagine a senior politician ever doing anything like that now. It's not recorded what Gladstone's reaction was, but he was favorably inclined to giving Smith more money to mount another exhibit. What had happened then is Smith realized that there were gaps in the flood story tablet he had, so he wanted to go out and find more tablets containing related stories. And the amazing thing was, the government ended up not funding him, but a newspaper did. It may have been the Daily Mail. And he went out to Iraq, and he went to Nineveh, and he went to where Rassam had been digging. Rassam had left the sea. He may have died by then. Rassam, who had dug the trenches to find the palace of Assurbanipal, was gone. And Smith just walked into those trenches, into the palace, to the tablet room, and he found another tablet describing the flood. Now, Smith mistakenly thought it was part of the Gilgamesh epic. It turns out that there were multiple flood stories, and this other one that he found belonged to something called the Epic of Atrahasis, which is the flood story was a motif that could be used in different epics. But anyway, he brought it back. He did not bring it back. His story goes very dark now because he had achieved all this by the age of 36. On the way back, he contracted dysentery and died. It was still very dangerous for Westerners to go out there. It's very sad. By 36, and he was famous at the moment, though. He had enough fame that the Queen awarded his survivors a pension of 150 pounds, which I assume was adequate. But that really is the most important figure in Assyriology, because the archaeologists could not read the tablets, but he could, and he was probably the best scholar of Assyrian at the time. There were other figures, though, too. Edward Hincks was an Irish clergyman who made important contributions, as well as Henry Rawlinson, who had done the original decipherment of the cliffs of the Middle Babylonian on the cliffs at Behistun. So this is where Assyriology got going, the understanding of these tablets. Now, the title here is Dubar at the British Museum. I will tell you that it was maybe 50-50. I haven't looked at it I haven't looked at their older translations to see how good or bad they are. One thing I do know is they were very bad at proper names. Izdubar is their idea of what Gilgamesh was. And the basic problem was in these tablets, it mixed both Sumerian and Akkadian elements, and the same sign could have both the value in Sumerian, a sound value in Sumerian, and a sound value in Akkadian. Remember, it's a very bilingual culture. We aren't used to that in the US as much. But they would take the signs that they thought, they didn't even know what Sumerian was. That hadn't been discovered. They weren't aware of its existence. So they thought all these signs were Akkadian, so they should be read with Akkadian sign values. So it came out as Izdubar, where if you read it in the Sumerian fashion, it comes out as Gilgamesh. So that took a couple of generations to get fixed. But this is very different from Homer and Virgil, is that this epic comes in fragments, and it's a big as I said, it's the largest jigsaw puzzle effort in human history, as far as I know. And it's been going on for 170 years. And that's important to realize is the translation I asked you to read just came out. It was the second edition that came out in 2019. He incorporated at least 5 or 10 new fragments that fill in the gaps in the Gilgamesh epic we have. And at the moment, our understanding is probably at about the 2/3 mark. Particularly, most of the stuff in the middle is missing. Luckily, we have the beginning and the end, the most important parts, but the biggest gaps are in the middle.
John?
Yes.
It was such a bestseller and all over the place. Then why is it so hard to find, I know this is kind of a naive question. I know things got broken up over the course of 2,000 or 3,000 years, but why is this so hard to piece together then if it was all over the place and so ubiquitous?
Well, the pieces are very small. And the other thing is part of I'll come back to the literary history. There were very different versions of the Gilgamesh epic floating around. And let me get into that actually. Yes, literary history of the Gilgamesh epic. It says the earliest surviving great work of literature. Basically, it begins, literary history of Gilgamesh begins with 5 Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was the Sumerian version of Gilgamesh. That sort of variation occurs in other places as well, B and G. And so these were evidently started as folk tales told about a grand historical figure. Gilgamesh is mentioned in the king lists maintained by the Sumerians. He ruled about, if he was real, which maybe not likely but possible, he ruled about 2750 BC, which is a long time ago. Now, presumably writing had been invented, but there were probably an oral tradition of tales about Gilgamesh running all the way down through the 3rd millennium, from 3000 to 2000, down to a dynasty called the 3rd Dynasty of Ur, which was circa 2100 BC. Now, they were reduced to writing around about this time in Sumerian, not Assyrian, and they were probably performed as court entertainment, in particular for King Shulgi. You can imagine the king, and they were sung. We know that. You can imagine the king after a nice dinner calling for his musicians and singers to come out and perform these tales. It's important to note that they're independent stories. There are no connections between the 5 Sumerian poems. Now, some of those Sumerian poems deal with some of the same subjects as the later epic, like there's the Bull of Heaven story is one that occurs, and that independent story was eventually incorporated in the epic, but for the 3rd Dynasty of Ur, it was an independent story. Now, the first surviving version of the combined epic, known as the Old Babylonian version.
John, real quick, we know the date of 2100 BC because we have tablets or fragments of tablets that are dated as being 2100 BC.
No, the Babylonians and Sumerians dated from the regnal years, the kingship years of their kings. So we have relative dates. You say that you get a contract saying Old Babylonia will say, the 2nd year of the kingship of Hammurabi.
Right.
No, I'm not an archaeologist, but archaeologists, it's their black magic. They do it by looking at pottery styles and things like that, and to establish absolute dates.
So but it is based on some sort of.
Not from the tablets. I don't think there's they didn't use an absolute. They didn't use an absolute calendar from year zero.
But whatever it was 5 poems on something. Pottery or a tablet.
These were on clay tablets.
Okay,
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. By the way, they actually to create real dates, they use the sun eclipses that they recorded very well. Let's say in the 5th year of this king, there was an eclipse, and they could connect it to when it really happened, and then derive those dates exactly from the tablets.
That's mostly 1st millennium, though, as I remember a rule of thumb in dating in Mesopotamia. If you're in the 3rd millennium, our dates are maybe a century, you're within a century of the real date. In the 2nd millennium, it's 10 years. In the 1st millennium, it's much more accurate, and that's where the astronomical data comes in. I don't think the 3rd millennium is always pretty vague temporally. In terms of dates. I mean, I say it says circa 2100, it could be 2200, 2000, I don't know.
But
anyway,
sometime it has to do with the context in which they find, like Gilgamesh fragments. If they can associate that with something that can be dated to a king's regnal year, then they've got it. And if it's plus or minus 100 years, that's pretty good.
Yeah, that's, well, anyway, as it moved from, as Akkadian became more dominant in the Old Babylonian period, this would be around the 18th century BC, Sumerian was starting to fade. It was becoming strictly a school language that only the learned learned. And they still dominated literature, but very few people at that time could read, obviously. But at some point, some lone genius, I assume it was an individual, took all this Gilgamesh material, and he produced, or she, produced what's called the Old Babylonian version. Unfortunately, very few fragments of it have survived. So we don't know much about it. People think it has the best poetry of any of the Gilgamesh traditions. You can say negative things about the standard edition, the one found in Ashurbanipal's library, but the most annoying factor is the relentless repetitiveness. The Old Babylonian version doesn't have that. So anyway, one thing, these things don't have titles in the modern. There's no Epic of Gilgamesh. There's no story of Gilgamesh. They were called typically by the first words of the first tablet. So the Old Babylonian version is called Shuto Eli Shari, meaning surpassing all other kings. That's an epithet of Gilgamesh. Now we know in the period after the 18th century, there were fragments that are found all over the place in the Middle East with multiple versions of the epic. For example, there's one where the flood story has not been incorporated. I haven't seen the tablets myself. I don't know how they know that, but it's accepted. Now, at some point, somebody who's...
One question.
Yes.
You said at the beginning that they were, when they were talking, they would repeat what the other person said.
Yes.
And then so is it possible that this is kind of the same thing? They repeat the story and they go back. I mean, the same thing that you use in the language, they use it in the stories. They repeat the story and they go, or not?
When I say they repeat it, I'm thinking of when Gilgamesh sees a dream. The gods send Gilgamesh dreams. There's a lot of dreaming going on in the epic. And on one occasion, the gods send Gilgamesh a dream foretelling, because they use dreams to forecast the future, foretelling the arrival of Enkidu. And so Gilgamesh has the dream, and it's described in the first person. It's described in the third person as Gilgamesh sees a rock fall from heaven. And then he goes to his mother Ninsu and said, "Mother," and then he tells the story to his mother in the first person, "I have seen a rock fall from heaven." And Ninsun replies, and she retells the exact same language in the second person. "You have seen a rock fall from heaven." That's all I mean by it. It's just a strange style by our standards. So, but anyway,
I was commenting on what that style made me really think of is that this was music.
Yeah,
if you think of this as music, then having those repetitions is like having a chorus in a song and adding another line as you go. So what to us seems repetitious when we read it is actually an indication of how it was performed. If people didn't like it, we wouldn't know about it.
Yeah, I did say it was probably performed at the royal court as entertainment, and it's generally assumed it was accompanied by music or was set to music, but I don't know what the evidence is for that. It's just... I think
it only makes sense as music.
I think that really is a great point, because when you have a song now, they repeat the same thing, they repeat because they work with the song. So
yeah,
it's exactly like that. That's great.
That's what I thought.
Yes. Well, anyway, after the Old Babylonian version, several centuries go by. Recall, this is a literary tradition. The Gilgamesh tradition covers over 1,000 years. It's quite impressive. But in the centuries following the Old Babylonian period, and we don't know his dates, but a character named Sin Leki Unini. He's somewhere in the 13th to the 10th centuries. He creates what we now call the Standard Babylonian version, because it's what was found in Ashurbanipal's library. And it has the Incipit. Incipit is just Latin for it begins. It means the first, it's how the Babylonians refer to this epic. Shanakba Imu, he who saw the abyss. In modern terms, we would think he who sees the, Gilgamesh went out and saw a lot of amazing things when he was wandering around the world after Enkidu's death. And Sin Leki Unini created, and by the way, his name means seen who accepts my prayer. And that's an interesting name because it has an Akkadian element, Leki, and a Sumerian element, Unini. But it's, why he's called that, we don't know. But as I've said a couple of times, we have about 2/3 of the longer, this is the 12 tablet version that has been recovered. And they were excellent copies. They're always cited as the best copies of cuneiform we have. They had the highest, most talented scribes working on them, obviously. You can get some really ugly cuneiform. So some technical questions. It's written in poetry. This, well, the old Babylon, they're all written in poetry, but Babylonian poetry is not completely understood. It's somewhat like Old English meter, if you're familiar with that. It's stress-based and there's no end rhyme. They don't rhyme things as you do in a lot of English poetry. It's very, unlike Old English, there's no alliteration. Old English poetry, you know, Beowulf will, the initial consonants of words will frequently agree. I can't think of an example offhand. But each line of Akkadian verse will be, and bear with me, the example is much more interesting than the explanation. Each line of Akkadian verse can be divided into 3 or 4 smaller units, which consists of a word with its adjuncts, prepositions, adjectives, you know, the little words next to the nouns. Sometimes the line will be longer than 4 units, but the norm is 3 or 4. And each unit gets a beat. And this is very reminiscent of Anglo-Saxon. But the beat falls on the syllable that receives the principal stress. And basically, you also get a caesura because you'll have 4 units. They fall into 2 equal halves, either side of the break, the caesura. And lines are often in pairs to form couplets. They say the same thing twice, but with synonyms. They do that a lot. So here's an example. Sabitum anaruki inatal shumma Ushamma analabisha amata ikabi. Iti ramani shamma she imtalik. As the tavern keeper watched him in the distance, talking to herself, she spoke a word, taking counsel in her own mind. So basically what I've highlighted in red is the stress portion. We can't prove it was a stress accent, but it is in every other Semitic language. Akkadian is Semitic, so we make that assumption. We don't think it was tone, but and this is fairly typical. So it was poetic. Very simple poetry, by the way. They did not have a high style. In fact, the old Babylonian version is famous for its simplicity. The standard version, as found in Ashurbanipal's library, is written in a literary dialect called Standard Babylonian, which looks very artificial in some ways. It may have been a high style that people didn't actually speak in the street. But the old Babylonian version, people could have spoken it in the street and sounded normal, we think. So basically, can we still understand Gilgamesh? I mean, it's a completely different culture. I'm sure you were puzzled by a lot. George, in that translation that I asked you to read, he doesn't give a lot of notes about substance. It's a completely different culture. You know, the motives of the people can be, you know, quite opaque. But anyway, it's basically, it's in the beginning of the poem, and this is the first 10 lines of tablet 1, the very beginning. Shanakba imuru ishtimati kalamu chasu Gilgamesh Shanakba imuru ishtimatu kalamu chasu. A lot of repetition. The 3 dots there are a break, by the way. We now know what's in there, but I didn't have access to the original Akkadian text. It's in the translation. Nafcha nemeki shakalami ichuz Niseta imurma katimti iptu ubla tema shalam abubi. Ochavukta ilakamma anechu shupshach shakani nanare kalum manachti. He who saw the deep, I had it on the script, but I'll translate it for you. He who saw the deep, and it's usually taken to mean he who saw everything. He who saw the deep, the foundations of the land, Gilgamesh who saw the deep, the foundation of the land, well-versed in everything. He saw what was hidden, he opened what was concealed. He brought reports from before the flood. That's the word abubi, flood. And it flood in the sense of great deluge. He came a long way, tired and at peace. He put on a naru, that's a stone stela, a stela actually being metal. He put on a stela all his efforts. And that's the opening. So basically it's a tale who went out, saw a great many things, came back tired, but at peace. And he recorded all of his, everything he experienced. Now this is the next line, this is the next section, only in English here, there's line 11 to 21. He built the rampart of Uruk the sheepfold. That's typically how they refer to Uruk. It came with that epithet, the sheepfold. He built the rampart of Uruk the sheepfold, of Hole Eana, that was a temple in Uruk, of Hole Eana, the sacred storehouse. And then he climbs, he switches in, there's a break there, the 3 dots. He switches into the second person, says, climb Uruk's wall and walk back and forth, survey the foundations, examine the brickwork, where its bricks not fired in an oven, do the 7 sages not lay its foundations? Well, you need a little bit of, this is sort of the main motif of the epic, is that Gilgamesh is a man of the city, and he's very proud of it, particularly of the wall. And he said, did the 7 sages not lay its foundation? The 7 sages were 7 wise men who, legendary, of course. I believe we have their names, but it's all legendary. They're the people who are supposed to have laid out 7 cities of Sumer. And they specifically, they built the wall of Uruk. And it doesn't seem, these are 7 sages. There's a later kind of Christian legend about the 7 sleepers of Ephesus. It doesn't appear that this has anything to do with that, just they picked that 7 is a nice number. But keep that in mind, that Gilgamesh is, very proud of his city. It's very important to him. And this is before any of his sufferings. But right after this statement, though, at the beginning of the epic, line 22 and 23, it switches into prose. There's no detectable meter in this. And it's a description of Uruk, a square mile-less city, a square mile date grove, a square mile-less clay pit, half a square mile the temple of Ishtar, 3 square miles and a half is Uruk's expanse. Now, Andrew George, who's our leading Gilgamesh scholar, his interpretation is that Gilgamesh has returned home tired but wiser. All humans are mortal. His attention is focused on the city of Uruk. The individual dies, but the community goes on. And then the point is reinforced at the very end of the poem. And this ties into the literary history. I'll come back to it, the history of the text. And these are the final verses up to the end of tablet 11. It's the end of what we think is the original poem. And this is after Gilgamesh has the snake stolen. The snake stole the tree of life from him, the plant of life, and he's coming back with Ur-Shanabi. Why Ur-Shanabi is coming with him is unclear, so Gilgamesh can have somebody to talk to. When they arrived in Uruk the sheepfold, said Gilgamesh to him, to Ur-Shanabi, the boatman, O Ur-Shanabi, climb Uruk's wall. Note, the first time it's mentioned, it's addressed to the reader, climb Uruk's wall. This time it's addressed to Ur-Shanabi. O Ur-Shanabi, climb Uruk's wall and walk back and forth, survey its foundations, examine the brickworks, the exact same wording, were its bricks not fired in an oven, did the 7 sages not lay its foundations? And then the very finest section very final line in the poem is this prose description of Uruk. Very interesting. But
That prose sentence.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't it be divisible around the repetition of a square mile, a square mile, a square mile?
This is George's claim. I'll take his word for it. I'm not an expert in Babylonian poetry, but his feeling is it's not a poem.
Okay, I mean, all I'm saying is that there are three thoughts there, and they combined a concept with something new. So a square mile of date grove, a square mile of clay pit, those phrases must have something that sound similar. Don't you think?
Let me go look at the Akkadian here. No, I don't have access to it. You're claiming this is poetry?
No, I'm not claiming it's poetry. I'm just suggesting that if you think of it being spoken, there's a natural rhythm on those three things, yeah. And then it's repeated in the next sentence. So it just seems kind of just musical.
Yeah,
so even though. So is a lyric poetry? Sometimes you just.
It's Akkadian poetry isn't that well understood.
Right.
But
I'm just talking about what's a plausible interpretation.
Well, it is chosen to end the epic, that description, the description of Uruk. After Gilgamesh has suffered great loss and realized he will never live forever.
Right.
So your focus is being shifted to the city, the community.
John, are we sure this is the end of the epic? Maybe it's the last piece that was found.
Oh, there's a tablet 12, which was found. It's a 12 tablet epic, but tablet 12 is a very strange addition, and it's generally considered an addition because Enkidu, who died in tablet 7, is alive in tablet 12. And it's a tale of a visit by Enkidu to the underworld, where he gets trapped down there. He was supposed to keep quiet and not let the dead see him, notice him, but he didn't. So they forced him to stay. He eventually is released, but it's basically a description of how bad things are in the underworld. It's a dark, dreary place, no hope of escape, nothing to do. But it looks like Sinleki Unini may have attached it because it sort of underscored what human fate was going to be, and he didn't. The scribe didn't pay too much attention to its illogical nature. But this is thought to be the original end of the epic.
John?
Yes?
To me, it sounds a little bit like this is a story for young people or for children, because the whole thing is that how when you are young, you think that you can do everything, you think you are, immortal, and then you grow up, and then, so the whole tale is telling you that, for me, it sounds really like a story that you will tell your kids. This is what happened, and this is all these stories, and because the moral is that you grow up and you become smarter and you become wiser and you become more concerned about the others, etc.
Yeah.
Well, the only thing is, I'm sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
We don't have any information on how old Gilgamesh was at the time of the epic, or Enkidu, but he sounds awfully young, and people in the medieval period could lead armies at age 14. So I don't think he was an adolescent. He was older than that, but it is very much a tale of a young man suffering and gaining wisdom.
Not him being as old or young, but it's a story that you will take a young person to say, you have to grow up. look at this, you give
Yeah.
the moral of, that kind of thing.
Oh, that's very much in there.
I mean, couldn't you compare it to an opera? I mean, the story is not something that anybody can take for real, but when you think of modern operas, which are clearly for adult entertainment, right? They have the same degree of unreality about them, but they're an opportunity to express other things.
The only thing is I can think of, and I don't know, maybe they had different standards of being PG-13. There's awfully a lot of, so to speak, inappropriate activity going on, especially when they're talking about Gilgamesh sleeping with the first sleeping with the bride before the groom gets the bride, and then Enkidu having the fight with him, based on the fact, or a wrestling match, so to speak. So, in that regard, I don't know what was the tolerance of, for children, obviously, to be. And also, I wanted to also stress and understand that concept of him being so frivolous is also has to do with the fact that he's an adolescent or immature, and getting that first, obviously, taste of the bride prior to the groom taking it.
It's all very unclear because you use the word immature. That's our concept. I mean, public manners among the elite could have been so bad that that what they did might have been considered perfectly acceptable because they were the elite. But we really don't know. We do have a reasonable interpretation of what the poem is all about, and I find it convincing.
Yeah. John, I'm still a little, I'm kind of like you in college. I don't know what course it was, but everybody was reading the Gilgamesh epic, and it's like, here it is. This is the root story of all other ancient texts like the Bible and all the rest of it. It was just a given, and I'm now listening to you this evening, getting a far different impression about what it is this is. This is kind of a bunch of fragments that have been put together. It's clearly a very old story, but it's not necessarily and no pun intended, the narrative for all these other, for example, flood narratives.
We know there were different versions, but this is what was canonized, canonicalized in Ashurbanipal's library. It's the 12 tablets where we possess about 2/3 of the content.
Right.
That's by far the most complete version there is. Everything else is a small fragment, except for a couple of the old Babylonian ones.
Right.
So that there are undoubtedly competitors out there. Just people will take the same legends and turn them into different narratives today, and in genres like science fiction and what have you. This is what's going on here, but this is not the only possible Gilgamesh epic. But
well, it's also not the only possible, for example, flood story.
No.
And it may be that the Gilgamesh epic, as it was finally canonized in Ashurbanipal's library, is itself just a collection of early stories.
Let me go on. There's an argument for single authorship of a dominant author, and it's a pretty good one.
Okay. Good, thank you.
Oops. Okay, here we come. Oh. This is George's theory. I forgot about that slide. That piece of whatever, square mile is city, a square mile date grove, a square mile is clay pit, half a square mile the temple of Ishtar, etc. This is George's analysis. He thinks it was quite conscious by the scribe. The city is the dwelling houses and procreation. Date grove is food production. Clay pits is manufacturing and industry. Temples is the spiritual and intellectual life. And these are the elements that make up a city beyond the individual. Uruk's expanse is the sum of human life. The message of the Gilgamesh epic, where every human dies except Utanapishti, the community is what matters, not what any individual does. the community goes on, the individual doesn't. Now this doesn't sound like very much like Western individualism. You could associate it with Asian cultures more. But that's George's claim as to what the dominant theme of the epic is. And I find it pretty convincing. Anyway, the other issue is who wrote this thing. As I said, it started out as oral, unconnected stories about a legendary hero. But there's somebody called Sinleki Unini who is named, the librarians in Ashurbanipal's library actually functioned like librarians. We have catalogs by them, and they would list all the documents, the clay tablets they had, and they had one for Gilgamesh. And these scribes who worked in these libraries, individual families would come to dominate them, and there were several prominent scribal families who sort of controlled the tablet house, if I can call it. That's a literal translation of the Akkadian. They controlled the tablet house for generations. And somebody with this name, Sinleki Unini, the Akkadian is this. It was Ishkaru Gilgamesh Shapi Sinleki Unini, which translates as the series of Gilgamesh as authored by Sinleki Unini. So the question is, what does authored mean? They're pretty sure about the meaning of Shapi, meaning authored by. So you can interpret his position in at least two ways. He was a legendary poet, like Homer, credited in later memory with composing the first version of the traditional Babylonian poem that went in its final form, it went by the series. It was called Series of Gilgamesh, or Shah Nakba Imaru. In the library, they called it Series of Gilgamesh. Or he wasn't the original poet, but he was a later scholar who sort of looked at all the fragments, pulled stuff together, and he established the text of the Epic of Gilgamesh in the standard edition, and that's the Ashurbanipal library one. That's what Andrew George leans to the latter opinion. And one of the fundamental problems is we don't have accurate dates for when this guy lived, Sinleki Unini. Best guess now is 13 to 10 BC, 1300 to 1000 BC, which is a big period. George is he's a bit naive perhaps, but he thinks Sinleki Unini made a major creative contribution. He wasn't just pulling things together. For one thing, he produced a single text of Gilgamesh where previously there had been many, and he also made it stick. It did end up in a high status place in Ashurbanipal's library. And he said, as an interesting textual feature, the Old Babylonian had the incipit that, again, those are the first words of the epic, had the incipit Shutor Eli Shari. Now in the standard version, which is over 1,000 years later, those words occur at tablet 1, line 29. In other words, there are 28 lines before that. And Sinleki Unini, George thinks it was Sinleki Unini who added them. And those are the lines that include the inspection of Uruk's wall. He also added lines at the end, also including the inspection of Uruk's wall. And that was a major shift. As I said, the focus of the poem went from, if you look at the rest of the poem, it's all about beating Humbaba, killing the bull of heaven. It's all heroic king stuff. But the beginning and the end is all focused on acquisition of wisdom through experience and personal suffering. And I don't see the evidence for the second last bullet. George also claims that Sinleki Unini added the tale of the flood. Now, the tale of the flood, since it has an independent existence, probably is an addition to the epic. It was interpolated at some point. So basically, there was a creative person who transformed the poem from an account of the glorious feats and heroic exploits of the mightiest king ever to a very somber meditation on the doom of man, which is quite a shift when you think about it. Personal motives of Sinleki Unini are unknown. It does sound very middle-aged to me, but middle-aged depressive. but it's not a happy story in many ways. Well, there's some other issues we can discuss. There were parallels to the Bible. The Garden of Eden is plain, you know, and we've been through it before. There's a tempting woman.
John, could I ask you a question?
Yes.
No, I'm sorry.
No question?
Yeah, it'll come back to me.
Oh, okay. Well, we've discussed the Garden of Eden parallel. It's the only point I found weak is that fourth bullet down there. The snake is present in both, but they're doing completely different things, the snake, in the two stories. Snake is stealing the tree of life in Gilgamesh. It's offering the knowledge of good and evil to Adam in the Bible, and maybe at a higher thematic level it makes sense, but I didn't see that as very strong. Now, it has been suggested there's language in Ecclesiastes, a wisdom book in the Hebrew Bible, that sounds an awful lot. Shadori, the divine barmaid, tavern keeper, gave some very famous advice to Gilgamesh that he should give up all hope of immortality. And this is before he gets to Utanapishtim. I didn't include that in the summary. Shadori gave him some very famous advice, and it sounds, may your belly be full, may you be happy with your wife and children, may you keep clean, rub oil on your head, and enjoy life. That's one of the most famous lines, and I paraphrase it, I haven't memorized it. But there's language in Ecclesiastes that sounds remarkably like that. Now, in the script I couldn't present, I was going to compare the two. It sounds convincing to me that the author of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet is what he's called, may well have had access to something that looked a lot like Gilgamesh, that passage in Gilgamesh, which, you know, will never be provable, but problem with all this business, you can't assess the probabilities. In fact, you have two similar passages which could well be cliches, you know, be happy, enjoy your wife and family. That's like, have a nice day.
Yeah. It sounds like you're saying, John, the dating of this is this Shinlin Nanini.
That's his name. I didn't.
It is around somewhere around 1000 BC to 1200 BC.
Yeah, correct.
Which, you know, in the scheme of things, is not that much antecedent to the other traditions we're talking about, which is Greek or Hebrew. Not to mention what other, you know, Armenian, Indian, etc. So I'm inclined to now think of the Gilgamesh epic as just another one of these kind of foundational narratives that you know, and this one happens to be, you know, sort of Babylonian as opposed to Hebrew or Greek. That it's not so much that, oh, the Greeks and the Hebrews, they all just read Gilgamesh. It's all, Gilgamesh was the big antecedent.
I think it's unknowable. I think there probably was a literary culture in Mesopotamia extending to the west where the Greek colonies would have come into contact with it, or else the Jews coming back from Babylon could have brought the flood story directly. But I think these themes and motifs were just floating around. Now, the exact means of transmission, say from Mesopotamia to, you know, the Greek cities, is totally unclear. I mean, no Greek. I'm not aware of a Greek who learned Akkadian at any point. So they had to deal with translations, but in what language the translation was. Now, these were very multilingual societies. I just said I've never heard of a Greek who learned Akkadian. It could well have happened, but there's no documentation for it.
I guess my point is, I think it's a modernist impulse to look at cause and effect as between these stories and traditions. The Greeks may have, you know, had you know, a hero story like this independently.
Yeah.
Or the Gilgamesh may have borrowed the flood story from a very early Hebrew or Palestinian
but the flood story was current in the old Babylonian period, 1800 BC. So the Jews weren't even Jews in 1800 BC.
Exactly.
They were Canaanites.
Yeah.
Now, why do you say the flood story was current in 1800 BC?
Because there's an epic. There's an epic
All
that
that
describes a
Babylonian
flood.
version, right?
But was it
There
the
are-
Gilgamesh epic?
No, it was Atrahasis. There's more to Akkadian literature than Gilgamesh, but there are other epics which I haven't discussed very much. But there's a record of a flood story
Right.
in the firmly dated to approximately 1800 BC. So it's very old. It's the
So
oldest one in the world.
Gilgamesh
Yeah,
could
but
have
can I say,
appropriated-
John?
Gilgamesh could have
Yes.
appropriated that flood story from that older epic. It didn't originate it necessarily.
but here's the thing. When you actually read this, there are sections where the Assyrian version has blanked out, and Andrews has put in pieces from the older Babylonian epics. Right? He's done that throughout, and the point is that it runs along seamlessly. The style is exactly the same, and the repetitions are similar. And then when it comes back into the later tablet, once again, it's a very smooth transition. So you can see that that as a composition, it's got to go back to 2000 BC.
Yeah, scholarly opinion has gravitated to a position that the standard edition text and the old Babylonian text were quite similar. But they provide different.
But also the old Babylonian texts were schoolboy texts.
Yeah. Oh, that's an important point. I forgot.
They were already, these were classics that were being used as practice material at that time. So it's older than that because it's not, that's not contemporary.
Yeah, actually, that's an excellent point. I should have made it myself. Is most of old Babylonian literature. Old Babylonia was regarded as the highest of high cultures. It was King Hammurabi, and so their literature became the models for training scribes. And the way the scribes learned how to write was to copy out the classics. And it's an unfortunate circumstance, but we actually have very little Old Babylonian, native, original Old Babylonian tablets. What we do have are products of scribal schools. And it's written in Old Babylonian, it's complex, but we know they're copying Old Babylonian text because it's written in, they're writing in Old Babylonian dialect, which they probably didn't know, they didn't speak. But we do have other Old Babylonian text, letters and contracts, where we can tell what the linguistic features are. We just happen not to have much literature from the Old Babylonian period.
John,
they're all copies. Because
can I intercede? I noticed that Ava wanted to ask a question for quite a while.
Oh, okay.
And she's never get a chance to talk. Ava, do you hear me? Go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, we know that the tablets remain very difficult to read. And since we know Mesopotamia was bilingual in nature, whom was supposed to read these ancient tablets? Or is that a naive question?
No, it's a very good question. Literacy, the level of literacy was undoubtedly extremely low, but being a scribe was a profession where we know they had schools, particularly in the first millennium. It got very professionalized, and as I said, they had families who dominated because they're named. Sinleki Unini is the ancestor of many scribes in the records. He's actually listed, so we pretty sure he existed. But what percentage of the population? It's pretty clear that nobles mostly couldn't read and write. Aristocrats, because the one who does, Ashurbanipal himself, he makes a big point of bragging that he knows how to read and write, which suggests that many of his peers couldn't. And so if the aristocrats couldn't read, and there are other clues too, and when you have a letter, when you write a letter to somebody in Akkadian, the formula is speak to so-and-so, thus says so-and-so. It's assuming that the letter is being read out loud to the recipient.
Yeah, I think there was a class of scribes that,
Yeah,
that
there was a
basically did all
class. So
the writing and reading.
a minute portion of the population had a high degree of literacy. How much merchants knew, that would have been useful in business? I don't. There's a lot of clay tablets with writing on them in a dialect called Old Assyrian that was up in Anatolia, which is now Turkey, which suggests some merchants had very good high literacy levels. But whether they employed professional scribes to handle their written work is, as far as I know, unknown. So literacy was very rare. I mean, but well under 5% of the population, probably under 2% of the population.
But wouldn't you imagine that that a much wider audience than literate people were exposed to this material? I mean, this was entertainment in a royal court.
Yeah,
So
it would have been sung and performed to music.
State of the art in a civilization that had reached a very high level, which had lots of musicians. We've seen their bodies, unfortunately, at Ur 3.
Yes.
So we know that they had big, they knew how to throw a show.
Yeah, you're right, Paul. I was just thinking that you did have the entertainment element to it.
By the way, just wanted to add about the Greeks. Keep in mind that the Greeks lived in Western Anatolia from 1000 BC, and actually most of the epics were created there and then eventually migrated to the mainland later on. So they were probably in contact with that material from 8th, 9th century. I mean, that's when the oral tradition really developed.
Oh yeah, I agree. It's just the exact transmission route, which language is in particular, which language they encountered it, the material is unclear.
Yeah, it could be Aramaic.
That was the dominant language. When I'm sure some Greek merchants learned Aramaic very well.
Sure.
I'll be sort of the ant at the picnic still, though. To postulate these broad reliance theories, the Anatolians must have had exposure to this Gilgamesh epic text. I just don't, in what you've described, I don't see the evidence for it. I didn't even see, I see.
Well, they found the tablets in Anatolia.
Let me just finish. I see the 12 tablets in, Ashurbanipal's library, clearly. I see that there's some fragments of poems with related stories going back another 1,000 years further. I don't see where you said fragments of this text have been found all over the Middle East, from ancient times. It's everywhere. Maybe not in entirety, but wow, it was in Turkey and it was in Palestine and it was in, I don't see that. I see a couple of fragments of a text, which is apparently a very remarkable text. But whether it's this, Tom Sawyer of ancient foundational stories in numerous different adjacent cultures, I don't see where any actual evidence of that. I just hear postulation.
Well, it's Gilgamesh is over, I don't have the exact number, but Gilgamesh has over 200 attestations, all, in different areas of Middle East, fragments for the most part. And you can identify them as belonging. I'm sure mistakes have been made. Some fragments have been fitted into the jigsaw puzzle. Remember, the standard edition, the Ashurbanipal edition, is what everybody is trying to fit the fragments into. And if they may well have made mistakes where a given fragment may be a totally different stream of the Gilgamesh. We do have different versions of Gilgamesh. This is very similar to the Arabian Nights situation. It's closest to us in time. It's a collection of stories that started out as independent stories, but then over time, they were combined into a coherent narrative. unlike Gilgamesh, though, the stories stayed, they were independently identified as different stories. But there are different versions of the Arabian Nights. They didn't have copyright back then, and when in the Arabian Nights, they were frequently performed orally. It was in an urban culture, and it was entertainment for people. There were professionals who would go out and recite the Arabian Nights, and given the characteristics of oral poetry, individuals could vary it as much as they want, but
Yeah, and it seems to me the Egyptians would have been the great granddaddies of flooding and, descent to underworld stories.
Yeah, I mean,
vastly predating this, 1200.
Yeah, make a point that some features of Gilgamesh are probably motifs that occur in many different cultures. I agree. Is Gilgamesh the granddaddy of every?
But if they actually call him Bilgamesh, then it's not just a similar story; it's the same story.
Yeah, I did.
And I think that the spreading throughout the Middle East is absolutely factual.
Oh, yeah, and it's also Gilgamesh is the.
Let me just finish. Because the Akkadian became the international language.
Yeah.
For everybody in the Bronze Age. So where do you think they got that from? That was people who were trained in Babylonian scribal schools who then went out and brought this culture with them. And Gilgamesh was probably something that, some of them had along with them.
The weight of evidence that's a very good point. The general linguistic background here is Akkadian became the international, as English is today around the world, Akkadian became the international language of the Near East, including Egypt, and it was done for practical purposes. All the rulers from Babylonia through Ugarit down into Palestine, into Egypt, they employed scribes who would write to each other in Akkadian. And so, and this is the way English is used today as a lingua franca, all the diplomatic correspondence was done in Akkadian between the Hittites and the Egyptians, the Hittites and the Babylonians, all over. And it's odd when you think about it, because at the time, Egypt was the big, Egypt and the Hittites were the big powers. Mesopotamia had faded by the Bronze Age. This is about 1300 BC. But the Hittites and the Egyptians were willing to use Akkadian because it was convenient. Egyptian may have come to dominate, but it's my opinion the writing system was too difficult to be used internationally. But what Paul is saying is that the language spread, the writing system spread. It's only natural to assume that the culture came with it, because usually an Egyptian pharaoh would have hired scribes from Babylon. We don't have direct evidence of that, but there are clay tablets in Egypt that have been found that were part of the diplomatic archive. And they were in Akkadian, not Egyptian.
I think what the archaeology has shown is that there were waves. So the earliest literacy examples that we have are from Uruk, and within about 2500 BC, you start seeing cuneiform writing appearing in places like Ebla. So you have this first wave where this scribal technology, if you will, has gotten out into Syria, and then that kind of goes away. But then when the Babylonians, it becomes Akkadian, they do the same thing on a much, much bigger scale. And Akkadian just floods through the whole Fertile Crescent and becomes the international language.
Yeah, and the other reason for believing that all the Gilgamesh fragments sort of are connected is that no other work of literature spread so far and wide. The Babylonians had lots of other epics, and none of them got the same. Gilgamesh was just really popular.
Actually,
now it's unclear what the whole textual history. What version of Gilgamesh did they have in the kingdom of the Hittites? So we only have fragments. We don't know. Was it the same as the Ashurbanipal one, or was it different? Did some Hittite scribe get really creative and write their own? Quite possible.
No, but they found the Hittite version.
They found a fragment of it. They found a fragment of.
and they found it in central Anatolia in Bogaskoi.
It was not a complete version. It was just a fragment, and not a big one.
I'm just saying that we're talking about maybe 1500 BC.
Yeah.
So it was definitely available in Anatolia. There's no question
Oh yeah,
about
there's
it.
no doubt about it. Whether and when I say the fragment we found is very similar to something in the standard version or the Old Babylonian, it doesn't mean that the rest of the Hittite document that fragment belonged to could have been very different from the Akkadian version. That's quite possible. All we have is a positive piece of evidence that this fragment is very similar to what we know from Babylonia, and I mean not plot, actual words and language. I mean they use the same words, but anyway, all of this is. I wish the problem with ancient history is you can't assign probabilities to anything. All you can say is very likely, likely. Would be nice if we could have some basis for judging how likely something is. But the only thing is the Gilgamesh flood story, the similarity between Gilgamesh and what the Noah's flood is so striking that there's some sort of connection. It's hard to believe that two different cultures would come out with the idea to send out birds to find dry land from your ark when it's stuck on a mountain. That's something, to me, that seems to be borrowed. It's not a general story about a jerk, someone who's a jerk as a young man who grows into a wise man. That could be very international, I think. Come from many cultures independently, but actually finding, when the details match. But anyway.
John, I have a question.
Yes.
Why do you think they glorified prostitute who actually civilized Enkidu?
Well, we know...
She civilized him.
Yeah, well, I don't know of any other story like that of sexual initiation where a prostitute, maybe one of you can enlighten me.
She's a hero. She's a heroine of the story.
Well, they practiced. We know from Herodotus, the Babylonians practiced cultic prostitution, where
the sacred
aristocratic women would go spend time in the temple in service to the god and offer themselves to anybody who came in. Now, that was a Babylonian custom. Babylonians had another custom where aristocratic women would dedicate themselves to a god and sort of become like nuns. They would never have sex. They remained virgins. So it worked both. I've never understood it, frankly, what the psychological motivations are. But Shamhat
it's like Vespalka. It's like Vespalka from Rome, the ones that held. Yeah.
You mean the Vestal Virgins?
Vestal Virgin.
Yeah. I mean, the Babylonians had a somewhat comparable institution called the Naditus. Aristocratic women, if they were inconvenient to their families, they were the ones who got shoved off to live. It was called a gagu, a place where the Naditus lived, and it was probably quite comfortable, but they were sort of in a Vestal Virgin role. They they carried out the rites of the god, and it was lifelong. So
actually, if you remember in the story of Sargon,
it's Ava. I was thinking.
Hold on. I will go ahead. And then Greg.
I was thinking of Pompeii, where they had the symbols, directing you to the places.
Yeah.
Right, to the
prostitute
whorehouse.
Yes.
Paul had a question.
Nothing else in Akkadian literature like
just to say that why do you assume that prostitution had a negative connotation? Right.
Apparently it was.
That's the modern way that you think about it, but it's very possible, seems to me likely, that it meant something totally else in that society, that it didn't have this notion of shame, disrespect, and a horrible thing.
That's a perfect segue to the next section. This is the last section. So sexuality in the epic is one of the great mysteries. And so the key point is the Assyriologists are very divided as to whether non-heterosexual sex is part of the epic, because the epic is famously explicit, at least as far as heterosexual sex is concerned. You can read what's there. but that's exactly what the text says. It's unclear. When it says she bared her sex actually it really is her shame. They use the word for shame there. But this is when Enkidu finally seduces, when Shamkat finally seduces Enkidu, and for 6 days and 7 nights, Enkidu was erect as he coupled with Shamkat. That's taboo, means stand up straight. It also used in a sexual context. And there's the 6 and 7 days again, which, as I said before,
her name actually means head of shame, right?
Oh no, it's the same root
I'm joking.
Though, I hope you're joking.
Of course, but in English, I mean, don't you?
The root is connected to Sameach in Hebrew, happy, joy. Chag Sameach, happy holiday. It seems to be the same root.
Although Chag Sameach, as we say during the Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah, well, if you notice, there's a sh, an m, and an h in that name, and that at is the feminine ending. So
but
Sameach.
if you just slip an e between m and h, there it would be shame cat.
Yes. Anyway, so actually, this is very rare. This is the most explicit description of sex in Babylonian literature, I believe, which is why it always gets quoted, perks people up. So, but when it comes to non-heterosexual sex, it's much more circumspect, but there's always been a lot of suspicion that it's there. Gilgamesh is told that Enkidu is coming to see him, to meet him, in 2 dreams that the gods send. They send dreams to tell you the future, but it's gods who do it. And one of them is, the stars of heaven appeared above me like a rock from the sky. One fell down before me. I lifted it up, but way too much for me. Like a wife, I loved it, caressed and embraced it. And you, O mother, you made it my equal. He's talking about Enkidu there, who he hasn't met yet. A few lines later, he's compared to an axe. In a street of Uruk, the city, an axe was lying with a crowd gathered round. The land of Uruk was standing around it, and he repeats the line, like a wife, I loved it, caressed and embraced it. And you, O mother, and he's addressing himself to Ninsun here. He confides in her mother about everything, apparently. And you, O mother, you made it my equal. So there we have Enkidu is compared to a rock, a really masculine symbol, maybe. And then he's compared to an axe, something that you could commit violence with, another masculine. So, but Gilgamesh is saying that Enkidu was like a wife, and he loved it, caressed, and embraced it. And that's what it meant. The Akkadian is quite clear. Now, as far as homosexuality, same-sex sex, I don't know what the proper terms are now. Status for homosexuality in Mesopotamia is not really clear. It's not mentioned in the older law codes, like the Code of Hammurabi. It is mentioned in there are multiple law codes, things that you couldn't do. It's mentioned twice in the Middle Assyrian laws. I didn't quote the actual laws here because they're too difficult. But there's an Assyriologist at Johns Hopkins, Gerald Cooper, who says their attitudes towards homosexuality is very similar to the Greek. There's absolutely no stigma attached to active homosexual behavior if you were a free man, and doesn't apply to women, this is not the 21st century. If you were a free man with property, and I think the two pretty much were the same, you had to have property to be free. There was absolutely no stigma attached to active homosexual behavior with male prostitutes or slaves. The anal penetration of a fellow citizen, if in any way unwanted, this is citizen to citizen. If you raped anally a fellow citizen, that was a crime against the community, and it could be a capital offense. Nobody knows if these law codes are actually applied, though. And it is always shameful, regardless of whether you're a slave or a citizen or in between. It is shameful to be penetrated by another male, and it is a grave offense to penetrate a fellow citizen, thus shaming him. What that means, if the fellow citizen penetratee does it as a habit, or he's a professional prostitute, he's a prostitute, then that's a shameful thing for him. But the active male is not shamed at all. And as I understand it, that's very similar to the Greek and even the Roman attitude. But it doesn't mean you don't have free love for males in ancient Mesopotamia. Free male sexual opportunities were limited, and this is not a kind world. A free male sexual opportunities were limited to his wife, his slaves, and prostitutes. As in ancient Greek, the slaves and prostitutes could be male or female, and a normal Assyrian, I should have put male, a normal Assyrian male may well have frequented both. But from a wider perspective, they just don't talk about same-sex sex very much at all. So this is basically what we know about it. Did that make sense? If you're familiar, Roman attitudes towards sex are very interesting, and this seems, Roman and Greek attitudes are very interesting, and this seems very similar. But there's something else about, in addition to Gilgamesh calling Enkidu his wife and that he loved him, caressed him, and so there are two puns in the epic, possible puns. In those two dreams about Enkidu, which I've told you about, Enkidu, as I said, is compared to a rock, which is a masculine image of strength. The word used in Akkadian is kitsru. However, kitsru is phonetically very close to the word kezru, which is, I won't go into the whole structure of cults in Babylonia, but they had prostitutes working in these cults in honor of the gods. And it's the kezru is the male counterpart to a kezetu woman. It was a kind of cultic prostitute. And in the second quotation, Enkidu is also referred to an axe, chasinu, another masculine image. That evokes a word asinum, a cultic performer who is a eunuch and usually would take the female role in sexual acts, which that's if you only had one phonetic similarity, you just brush it off, but you have two and they're very close to each other. Now, Andrew George, this was a proposal of Anne Draftcorn Kilmer, a Assyriologist at the University of Chicago, that she proposed these were actually puns. He accepts the existence of them, he's convinced. There's also other evidence which, isn't as strong, so I won't go into it. But that raises very difficult questions, because if active homosexual activity was just fine, if you weren't raping a fellow citizen, then why do they have to introduce the homosexual theme surreptitiously into the epic this way? Because if they're puns, they must have been jokes that the audience was expected to perceive. So after dinner, do they laugh when they get to these lines, recognizing it? But that meant there was a certain level of embarrassment about the whole subject. But the facts are these, though. Homosexuality isn't mentioned in Mesopotamian literature very much, or in the laws. Those two Middle Assyrian laws are the only ones. So all this sex in the Epic of Gilgamesh makes it an outlier, if it's really there. But a simple fact is, the epic doesn't depict any actual sex between Gilgamesh and Enkidu in the standard version of any of the fragments. And you saw what was in there about Shamkat and Enkidu. It was really quite explicit. So my opinion is that those who see, I would be conservative about this, and those who see same-sex sex in the epic, there may well be a desire to see it. Confirmation bias, we call it. Given our own more enlightened sexual attitudes today, they're just looking for instances of that, which aren't really there. Could it be possible that in that culture, a high status male comparing his dear friend to a wife, the word is ashitu, and that is the word for wife, no other meaning. Is it just kind of a metaphor to indicate a friendship that is deep but non-sexual? It's a completely different culture. One thing I'm reminded on in this whole context is Margaret Mead was a famous anthropologist who wrote a book, Coming of Age in Samoa. I believe it was in the 30s. And she went to Samoa, the island in the Pacific, and she discovered the natives all were practicing free love with no sexual guilt and absolutely totally relaxed about it. And she wrote a really famous book about it that made her reputation, but then a later anthropologist left and debunked it completely. They had the same jealousies and violence and all sorts of bad things and many other peoples. But a Assyriologist sort of looking at this situation the same way. They're just reading things in that aren't there. But on the other hand, the evidence for the puns looks really good to me. So if they're true, there's definitely erotic tension between Enkidu and Gilgamesh. So what's going on? I mean, I'm ending it here because I don't have a clear solution. Now, at this point, many scholars bring in the David-Jonathan relationship in the Bible, which was very hot and heavy too, if you've read the Bible. And David was the son of, Jonathan was the heir to Saul, if I'm correct. And David was the usurper who eventually replaced Saul. But Jonathan was Saul's son, if I remember correctly. And also you mentioned the Achilles-Patroclus relation. In a way, it's kind of a vulgar question because it comes down to, do you think any of these people ever had sex or did they not? And we really don't know. I mean, it's portrayed as such, but the existence of puns, sexual puns in the epic this is a new result. It was only claimed about 20 years ago. Nobody had noticed it before. But anyway, that's all I have. So any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. You refer to the rocks. The reference, I think, is regular to a rock fallen from the sky.
Yeah. You will say meteor.
Could this be an iron? And of course, an ordinary rock falling from the sky is really no different from another rock. But an iron meteorite, and of course, we know that a fair bit of the early iron from the early or before the Iron Age is definitely meteoritic rock, and there are a bunch of them around the Middle East.
You will see other translations with meteor. I follow George, and I don't know why he picked rock here. I really don't, but meteor is a good translation too, which it seems like, a very high status male, very charismatic. Comparing them to a meteor seems pretty natural. So we don't have much information on the metaphorical systems of the Babylonians, how they thought. What's typically male, what's typically female. But rock and an axe suggests a male much more than a woman intuitively. But
let me mention one thing. The reception of this, okay? So this is being found, as you said, in the 1870s.
Yeah, I mean,
it's controversial because it creates a question of, is the Bible the Word of God?
Yes.
Right, it brings that into, so that's another lens to understand in looking at this, is that it was really hot stuff when it was discovered, because it kind of gave an argument to the atheists, an argument to the
very much so. It was the first independent existence in first independent evidence in a non-biblical context of an event mentioned in the Bible.
And that's not dead. That's still going on.
Oh yeah, but yes. Oh yeah, that.
There's even those who claim that the story of Christ being buried, before he resurrects, there's a time when he descends into hell.
Yeah, the howling of hell.
Some make the claim, well, that clearly just came from Gilgamesh,
Yeah, I mean,
like, hold on, I understand the agenda is to discredit, text taken as religious authority, but that doesn't, just because it's good for that doesn't mean that it's actually that.
I'll grant you that on the great majority of similarities, you have a point, but on the flood story and Gilgamesh resembling the Noah story, it looks very strong to me.
No, I agree.
Direct connection of some kind.
I agree with you. It's very similar. What the only question I have in my mind is, it's like the Gospels in the New Testament. There are those who think, in addition to the Synoptic Gospels, there was a Q. I think it's called the Q story.
Yeah.
Actually, the antecedent of all three of those. So I'm inclined to think there was an antecedent to both Gilgamesh and the Torah story. But the other thing I wanted to just footnote is, in the Bible, it cites that Abraham was from Ur of the Chaldees.
Yes.
So, the father of the chosen people, Abraham, was indeed from the region in which this cultural story may have been prevalent.
You know,
But
that's actually a
that idea
giveaway.
could be brought from because the culture comes from Mesopotamia at the time, you know, when the Jews started to awake as a nation. You know, they wanted to have a very noble heritage, and Mesopotamia was probably the center. And so it's the way it says in the Bible doesn't mean that it was so. I'm talking about from the historian point of view, not a religious person. You know, so I mean, the way it's described in the Bible doesn't mean that that's where he was from. It could have been made up later on.
Well, there's also
what is the
something in the
point,
thing
Paul?
itself. Saying that it was Ur of the Chaldees is a giveaway, because the Chaldees weren't there in ancient Babylon, right? The Chaldees arrived after the Bronze Age collapse in the Iron Age. And so when you start seeing history from that region in the first millennium, then it's the Ur of the Chaldees. The Ur that we're talking about is like, you know,
2000
2500
BC.
BC.
Yeah.
It's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
And it's really a shame that, you know, Paul did such an amazing presentation, and then I should have recorded, but at that time it didn't enter my mind, that really explained the ancient Ur and the city-states. I want to thank John. This was incredible. I mean, this is next level. It's great work. Fantastic work. And you know what? And that's why I got to bring awareness to this group, because some people, you know, that's why I'm going to post this. I recorded this today, and I'm sorry I didn't post the World War II yet. I'll record, we will post that as well. So we have 2 in 1. I mean, it's in separate recordings and stuff like that, but we've been getting a lot of hits, and the YouTube channel, just recently I got a notification that we got almost 2,000 hours watched, and we just opened it like less than a month ago. So that's awesome. And it's all our history presentation. This is a great beginning. So next time we're gonna meet in this same topic. Greg is gonna do Plutarch, Pericles. So, and that's going to be in October 16th, right? So I think we want to keep it in the same format. Greg, what do you think?
No, I don't think. First of all, I'm not a scholar like John, and also it's entirely different thing. What I think the way we should have it, I could give an introduction.
We can talk offline. We can talk offline, because I really like.
But people should read it, and we will discuss various parts of it.
So no paired Roman, just the Greek.
Yeah. I you know what? It's pretty dense. You know, even though, you know, just one life would be more than enough. And besides, you know, yeah, I know he paired the lives, but I just figured we'll just take this one life. You know, just read it and discuss that, because we also in the middle of kind of Greek presentations, right? We didn't get to Rome yet, so yeah, let's just do one.
No, what I meant, the same format. Obviously, you can suggest format, but I don't want to just to keep it as the you tell people what they read about. I want to have a topic flowing and people giving their idea as we had it today. Not the fact that it has to be as detailed. And obviously, this was the next level.
All right, I will prepare excerpt from his biography, and we'll discuss it. As we go, what that means. Whatever comes with it. Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, and one more thing. This Saturday we have Persian War Marathon. And it's going to be really incredible because, Richard is going to talk about the site of Persian, of a little, archaeological and literate, evidence that we have. And Lisa is going to talk about the Greek side of it. So that's how we divided it. And, hopefully, it's going to be an amazing, and will be amazing presentation. And then after that, Aaron is not here, but he's going to be talking about the Pacific War, Pearl Harbor, or we're getting to Pearl Harbor. I mean, you know, taking our sweet time. John, this was incredible. Thank you for everybody to log in. Anybody have any other questions or you want to discuss? Or, I mean, I still haven't jotted down everybody's ideas from last time you guys gave me. I have to put it all together and send a new schedule to everybody. But the group is growing. Now we have a new chapter, and this was the beginning of our ancient text. And this was, we came out with a bang, really. This was incredible. And
it was great, John. I just want to say it's not every night that you get to hear a oral Sumerian recitation in, I guess it was Sumerian, or was it Akkadian?
No, that was Akkadian.
Akkadian in a Massachusetts with an
I know,
accent.
it's very strange.
Very strange and wonderful.
Yes, thank you, John.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic job.
yeah, fantastic job. Thank you, John, and have a nice evening, guys.
Okay, thanks, everybody.
All right,
Bye.
thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you, Zach.
No, thank you.
Bye-bye. Good
Bye.
night.
Do I have to do anything now, Zach?
No, it's recorded on the Zoom.
Oh, good, great.
Thank you. Just send me the other one.
Yes, I will tomorrow.
Thank you, brother. All right, no problem. Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great job, John. Thank you.
Otherwise, have a good evening, everybody.
Okay, I'm gonna get dinner started.
Thank you. That wasn't that long.